everyone. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to Textile Talks. I'm Amy Milne, Executive Director of the Quilt Alliance, and I love seeing all the notes in the chat where everyone's connecting from. I'm connecting from the foothills of Western North Carolina, and it's a little cloudy today, but not going to dampen my spirit. I'm glad you chose to join us, and I invite you to introduce yourself if you'd like, if you haven't already done so. Today, we're honored and excited to share an interview with Victoria Findlay Wolfe, conducted by Teresa Duryea Wong. And after we watch the recorded interview, Victoria is going to join us for a Q&A. So as you think of questions, feel free to add them to the Q&A box. Textile Talks, if you're just joining us for the first time, many of you have heard this and know our partnership really well and tune in each week. But if this is your first time, let me tell you that Textile Talks is a weekly series. It's presented on Wednesdays at 2 p.m. Eastern Time in partnership with the Quilt Alliance and our three partner organizations shown here: International Quilt Museum, Studio Art Quilt Associates, and Surface Design Association. And all of the Textile Talks are recorded and available via YouTube. And my colleague Emma Parker will enter that link for the recording playlist in YouTube in the chat box now. The Quilt Alliance's mission is to document, preserve, and share the stories of all quilts and all quilt makers. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Quilt Alliance, we're a nonprofit, member-supported organization, and it's open to anyone, quilters and quilt lovers of any style, age, skill level, or location. We have individual members, and we have guild and group members, and our community has never been larger or more active or more important to us. And along those lines, I'd like to take this opportunity to invite you all to join us tomorrow for another Zoom at 4 p.m. Eastern Time for a panel discussion to discuss the impact of federal funding cuts to fiber arts organizations like the Quilt Alliance. Panelists will include myself, Elaine Yao of UC Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive, Susan Hudson, a Dene or Navajo artist, and the 2024 NEA National Heritage Fellow, and Karina Bennett of the Surface Design Association. So I'm going to ask Emma to put that registration link for tomorrow's panel in the chat now. It's a free event, and I hope you'll join us. So just a little housekeeping, a reminder to use the Q&A box for questions and the chat box for greetings. And if you have any tech questions or but put those questions in the Q&A so we don't miss them, and enter them at any time. You will see a survey pop up at the end of the webinar in your browser. That's a way for us to capture your feedback and get your commentary, ways we can improve. We really appreciate it. And next, later in the month, on the 28th, I think it is, I'm going to remind you before we leave today, we are going to have the 250th episode, can you believe it, of Textile Talks. And we would love to receive your feedback to share about what you've liked about Textile Talks, maybe your favorite episode, the types of Textile Talks that you have enjoyed. So send those in on the survey, or I'll give you a phone number at the end. You can call and actually leave an audio message. We have a live captioner on our call today providing the captioning, and if you would like to turn that on, look for the CC or show captions or live captions depending on the device you're using. And today's program has a pre-recorded component, so if the audio levels are low, just adjust the volume on your device. That happens sometimes. Zoom adjusts the audio so it can be a little quiet. Just a heads up on that. Today's program, as I mentioned, is an interview with Victoria Findlay Wolfe conducted by Teresa Duryea Wong. We recorded it on April 30th of this year. Victoria Findlay Wolfe is a New York City-based award-winning quilt artist, teacher, and author whose work embraces modern, traditional, and art quilting styles. A farm girl raised in Minnesota, her influences are heavily based on her grandmother's scrappy, colorful, double-knit polyester quilts, which started her on this textile journey. Her quilts have traveled the globe with notable exhibits in the US, Japan, Australia, and UK. Victoria won Best in Show at the first QuiltCon in 2013 with her quilt, Double-Edged Love, the first in her large series of double wedding ring quilts for which she is well known. Her quilting books include 15 Minutes of Play, Double Wedding Rings, Modern Quilt Magic, Playing with Purpose, and most recently, the Quilting Experience, a celebration of community and patchwork patterns that we're going to talk about today. Victoria is the founder of the New York City Metro Mod Quilt Guild, has served as a board member of the International Quilt Association, the Quilt Alliance, and the International Quilt Museum. And Teresa Duryea Wong is our interviewer today in the recording. She is an author, lecturer, and quilt historian. She's the author of Sewing and Survival, Native American Quilts from 1880 to 2022, and 5 additional books covering Japanese quilts and textiles and American quilts and cotton. Her newest book, which she co-authored, Kawaii Applique Quilts from Japan, will debut in spring of 2025. And she is a contributing writer, for Quilt Folk and other magazines. Teresa is a member of the International Quilt Museum Advisory Board and the Quilt Alliance Board. She has appeared on numerous quilting programs and podcasts, including The Quilt Show with Alexander Anderson and Ricky Timms, Quilting Arts TV, and the Craft Industry Alliance podcast. Teresa has presented hundreds of lectures to quilt guilds throughout the US, including QuiltCon, where she has lectured for the past 7 years. Her lectures have also reached quilters in Canada, the UK, and Korea. So we have an incredible program, and I'm not going to wait another minute. I'm going to play the recording of our interview, and then we'll return live with Victoria for questions, and that should be a lot of fun. Enjoy.
So thank you, Victoria. It's so great to spend some time with you this afternoon. Always good to
Very
catch
nice to
up.
see you. Thanks for
Yeah,
doing
yeah,
this.
yeah, it's been a while. So let's start with your new book. You have this beautiful new book called The Quilting Experience. And tell us a little bit, how would you describe this book? It's very unusual, mix of your personal stories and patterns. And how would you describe this for people?
It's a book that kind of encapsulates everything that I feel, what I love about the quilting world in general. It's I was realizing during COVID, first off, how much I missed how much the people and from teaching and going to quilt retreats and all of these things, how important that really was to my process. I'm very much a homebody, even though you see me out there doing all these things, but I am so much more comfortable when I'm at home. And it was kind of a shock to me during COVID how much I missed my people. And I was really thinking about, when we get together at quilt retreats with our friends and the things that we talk about. I'm thinking about how valuable some of the things that you learn from your group of women and men who show up at your retreats. And I really wanted to, put together a book that um, shared my experiences. Because to me, when I'm making a quilt, I feel like my life is going into those quilts, my daily life, right? And I feel like in all of my other books, it's all about process of a different part of a process. So the shift for myself was how much the community was important to me. So that's what I wanted in this book, was to really share what I love about quilt making, how people bring us together, how fibers bring us together. And I figured if I had all of these great stories and experiences from my own journey through quilt making, I figured everybody else was going to have that as well. And I had had some talks with a few of my friends just to kind of, brainstorm what are the things that we always talk about when we get together? What are themes that always come up no matter where we are, whether we're at a guild meeting or sitting around a quilt retreat or, just talking to a friend via Zoom, that kind of a thing. And we kind of narrowed it down to 12 different themes. So identity, traditions, comfort and healing, connections, aging, teachings and lessons learned, friendships, travel, remembering and grief, food, celebration, and new adventures. There are certainly many more things, but we felt like this was a really good rounded way to gather the stories that brings us together.
And those are such great, all of life's moments, really. You've
Oh,
captured. Yes.
exactly. And at the same time, when like I said, when I make a quilt, I feel like I'm stitching my life into the quilt. And so if all my books are about process, this is a whole another part of the process of what's going on in your daily life. How are you making connections? How are the baby that was born that you're thinking about when you're stitching together that baby quilt, or whatever happens during your life, that all of that is going into your quilt, so the quilts hold the story. So that story was just really important. So I wanted to be able to put this book together in a way that you're thinking about those life things. How do they relate to you? How is identity in quilt making important to you? When you get together with your friends, what's the food dish you always bring? What are the funny stories that have happened over a meal talking about quilts? All of these kinds of things. So I set the book up so that you would be sort of thinking about the theme, reading my prompts, reading all the other stories that I collected from all sorts of people, not just my friends. I put it open to everybody to send me stories. And, so that you'd really kind of contemplate and help pull together those thoughts on why you make a quilt and how you make a quilt. So that as you're working through the book, by the time that you get through all 12 chapters, you've now stitched your life into that quilt. So you're making the experience quilt.
Yeah, that's so
Yeah.
beautiful. So you really have built communities, literally,
Mm,
with, the quilt guilds and the retreats and all of your teaching. And so really
right.
what do those connections mean to you? I think that that's all about this book is about community building, right? So
Right.
what does that mean to you personally? And what do you think it'll
It was
say to
it
others?
was kind of a surprise to me. Like when I first started this, I never thought I wanted to teach. When I first did my first book. And then when I did, and I realized how valuable it was to share not just what I am, but what I get from the students as well. And again, it goes back to all of this, the stories and things that come up, the conversations that come up when you're either in class or with your guild. I've learned a lot of health things from having a whole bunch of women in the room, and that's valuable information. Um, I just I'm just blown away by how important the community is. And I'm so grateful to it that it's there. I think we're super lucky as quilters. I mean, I don't really belong to the golfers group. I don't golf, so I don't know what that community is like, but I know for this one in general that I can get on a plane, I can land anywhere and say, "Where's the quilters?" And I can have a perfect stranger come and have an amazing evening by making those connections just because we're quilters. And I just think we're just the luckiest community to be able to have
Yeah, so true, so true.
that.
So tell me about the everyone that you asked to contribute to the book, and you said you put out an open call, and you just have dozens and dozens of different voices in this
Yeah, I
book.
wanted to have a really rounded scope of the kind of stories. I knew from some of my friends who would have some really great stories because we've talked about them. So I encouraged them to submit stories. I put a couple different calls out for collecting stories for the book. It was really interesting to me after the first call, because when I get together with my friends for quilting retreat, it's because I want to laugh my head off.
Yeah,
My friends make me laugh in a way that so many other things in life just don't. So I just thought that was amazing, and I wanted to get kind of those stories. But I was really surprised because the first sort of big group of submissions that I got was really sort of how many times quilt making comes up in a sad situation, whether somebody is sick or made a quilt and lost the quilt, or getting through difficult times, which I think is really interesting. And they're also poignant and heartbreaking. And I put out a second call going, okay, where's all the funny ones? Because I know that we all get together for a good meal and a whole bunch of laughs. Yeah. So, I really wanted this to be a really well-rounded part that sort of hit all aspects of life, from things that we just, we all connect with. It might seem a very common thing that you think isn't so important, but you'll read it in a book and you'll be like, oh, I so get that. I understand that. I do that all the time, that kind of a thing. And then having those moments where you're like, gosh, I would have never thought that. I haven't ever gone through a fire. I had, never been in an earthquake, or, like all of these different sort of scenarios where you can really relate and connect to people on a different level. And also the most hilarious stories of things that
Any funny ones you want to share that stick out in your mind? Or
oh, there's been a few of them. There's one in the food group where they talked about a quilter's drinking game, and it turns out it was just about drinking water because you have to stay hydrated.
Yeah.
But the way that the story is written, it was just really, really funny. And some of the different experiences that I've had along the way, that some things from my quilt retreats and sort of the shenanigans that comes up. I'm sewing at a sewing machine, and every time I'd come back to the machine, the thread was cut because the gal next to me kept cutting my thread at the spool and I didn't see it. Like just funny shenanigan things that happen. And, there's just a lot of really good fun things in there, but also just making connections to people in ways, people that I didn't even know. I had a great time. I also have the Quilt Alliance, the QSOS stories in there, and diving in and finding really interesting ways that I wouldn't have ever thought that quilting connects with people.
So the QSOS stories are, let me just explain, for not everyone maybe knows that an acronym, but so the Quilt Alliance is a wonderful organization that you have served on the board in the past and been a longtime supporter of. The Quilt Alliance has tens of thousands of oral histories that have been collected since the 90s. And these are stored partly at the Library of Congress, at the American Folk Art Center, and also the Louis B. Nunn Center for Oral History at the University of Kentucky. And so the short an acronym that we use for these stories is Quilters Save Our Stories, or QSOS. Right. And so how did you, there's so many, how did you go about searching them, and how did you get the idea to search these oral histories and include these much, much older interviews in your book? It's so fascinating.
Well, I have a great admiration for the Quilt Alliance, having been on the board for a couple terms. And also, that's a great shout out to Amy Milne for her hard work, because when she was starting looking around for a venue for Quilters Take Manhattan, she had found me kind of by accident, and I offered up my space. And then they did my QSOS story. And this was before my book had ever come out, and never been interviewed before. And
this was like 2011, is that about right?
2011, yeah. And it was a very eye-opening experience. And so when I was working on this book, I went back and I had read my QSOS story, and it made me think, I was trying to think about, how far I've come, and reading that, and how my head was just in a completely different space. Meg Cox did my QSOS interview, and I have Meg who did the foreword for this book. So we're kind of making full circle moments with the with Quilt Alliance and with Meg. And I knew that there was a wealth of information there to be discovered. So as I was working on these stories, I knew that there were other little bits of information, so I could go in and search for different sets of words, and pulling up things, particularly the themes that I was trying to find specific snippets of stories, because the stories are also like 45 minutes. So I can look through an interview by looking up certain words and, finding the other bits that I thought were relevant to quilt making, that if I didn't get a regular story that fit it, that I could find bits of information to really make sure that I'm connecting as many different threads as I could, how each of these themes fit our life.
Yeah.
And
So
some of those that sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say yeah, that's so interesting. The way you can just zero in now on certain words within this 40 minute conversation that's been recorded.
Yeah, yeah, it was really fascinating. A couple that stand out. Well, Teddy Pruitt, who you guys did a QSOS, and I had already asked her if she had some other stories, because she's always telling amazing stories. So I knew that she would have one. But in her QSOS, she was asked, what questions should we be asking about quilts and quilt makers today? What questions should historians be asking? And she goes in and she talks a little bit about, what it is that she's looking for. And I just thought, well, just that snippet alone really helped sort of capture what the Quilt Alliance does, but it also really fit, the stories in the book and the theme and the process of it. So I loved kind of making those connections through that.
Was there
Raymond
any,
Houston.
yeah, was there anything that really surprised you about reading some of those older histories?
Yes. So Raymond Houston's in particular, I thought was really powerful about identity. As a male quilter, as a gay man, about fitting in. I thought it was just exceptional. I thought David White's QSOS interview, these are all listed in the book for where you can go and read the rest of the transcriptions as well. But he's a truck driver who quilts and makes quilts in his truck, which I thought was really fascinating. There was the Prisoner Project, Rosa Angelo, I think. She talks about learning to quilt in prison. I mean, there's just, again, things sometimes beyond the way that you think about quilting and where it happens. It's not just at your kitchen table
Yeah.
or, in a safe space or separate space, but, there's just a wealth of information and life in all of those stories, that it was just a real treat to dig through them and to
Yeah.
find all these little nuggets.
And as you pointed out, from all the diverse stories that you found, is that the great thing about the Quilt Alliance QSOS stories is that you don't have to be famous to be interviewed. You don't have to be famous to make a contribution.
Exactly.
I mean, it's truly capturing all types of stories of quilters.
Exactly. And it's a grassroots project. You can jump in, you can do it in your guild. We used to do it in the New York City Metro Mod Guild. We would do the interviews at the end of the meeting. So you just need a tape recorder and someone to ask the questions, and getting them transcribed and sending them in. So I love that it's anybody and everybody
Yeah, it
that can
really is.
send in their stories.
Yeah, it's so wonderful. Um, and also we do the Go Tell It videos, so someone can send in short videos as well as the longer version, oral history.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let me switch gears just a little bit now, and I want to talk about you as a quilter. And so many of us, myself included, have followed you for so many years. And I just remember back in the days when we used to all read blogs before we had so many social media choices. I remember watching you make this really long quilt. I don't know if it was 30 feet, 40 feet long or something. And I thought, oh my God, that's such a great idea. I never would have thought of something like that. Years later, I went to the International Quilt Festival and saw all your variations of the double wedding ring, and even included that story in the history of the quilt festival that I wrote about. And of course, one of your really amazing double wedding rings was the very first winner at QuiltCon. And in 2013, yeah. So, I mean, you've just have this amazing creativity. It just never ceases to amaze me what you come up with next. And now you have this incredible exhibition called the Option Exhibition. And I saw a version of it at the International Quilt Museum in Lincoln, Nebraska. And right now it's on view at the National Quilt Museum in Paducah, Kentucky. And we have this great video of it. So talk to us about it. Tell us where this idea came from, and walk us through this exhibition at Paducah.
Yeah, so Option Expedition, it's sort of a peek inside of my brain. So you just said about following me for all those years. So this really is like crawling in and kind of seeing where an idea starts and watching it evolve sort of in real time. So the exhibit is broken down at the moment into three subsets. One, which is called Red Dots. So it's the very first 8 quilts that I made in this series. And I was thinking about the standard basic shapes that we use in quilt making: quarter circles, squares, triangles, trapezoids, parallelograms, these kind of elements. And if I use them to come up with a basic concept. So what I was actually doing was taking those shapes and I was playing with them on my phone while I was traveling on an airplane. I was taking those images and I was swirling them around using a photo app, thinking about how do I get as many different variations on those basic shapes, whether I'm repeating, rotating, stretching, expanding. Sorry, I just got distracted. My lawnmower guy just showed up. So I got a lawnmower going in my ears. But thinking about how many different ways that I can manipulate that idea, because I like to take one idea and I kind of think about it like playing with a Rubik's Cube, where I'm turning it, and twisting it and getting as many different combinations. I'm doing this generally in my head, but this is a way for me to actually physically look at them. And it was kind of using it like a fidget spinner on the airplane as a way to sort of combat claustrophobia and anxiety on flying. So I would just play with these images for the entire flight, and I can come up with hundreds of different iterations of the style. So this was something that I'd been working on for about 6 or 7 years before COVID finally hit. And during COVID, that kept me home. So that was the first time then that I could actually then dive into these images that I've been looking at for years and having a reaction to them and thinking about, what was interesting to me. How do I move from one idea to the next? And what is it? The students would always ask me, how do you get your ideas? And to me, this is kind of showing how that happens. So those first 8 are sort of a basic on the design principles that we all know about: line, texture, movement, right? Repetition, all these different things. And then I wanted to show how if you start splicing those up and changing and morphing those ideas, what happens. And this is a very big part of my process. And so the second part of this is a piece called Trek, which is 12 pieces that can be viewed individually, but they're always hung together and often in a different configuration at every place that it's hung. So you saw it in a different configuration at the International Quilt Museum. This time, this was the first iteration of it. Now it's in a different configuration at the National Quilt Museum. And so this piece has meant that, your journey as a quilt maker changes. So the trek, the journey should look different every time you come back to it. So I look forward to continuing to exhibit this piece and being able to move those parts and pieces around and to see what connections then happen, because the connections visually will continue to change depending on how this piece is hung. And then the third subset of this series, it's pushing those elements even further. It's changing how I'm cutting, how I'm splicing, and that you can still look at these pieces and see those initial shapes. The edges of the quilt change. They're not just looking at a square or a rectangle. They're not just staying on the wall. They're bleeding onto the floor. The panels are shifting, they're twisting, they're becoming larger, they're separating, but yet again, you can still identify those basic things that we started in the first part of the series. So to me, this exhibit has been very long and I have hundreds more of them. I'm not going to make them all. But every day I can go back, I flip through the images on my phone to see what am I having a conversation with at that moment? What is important to me? What looks exciting? And, it's really also about following intuition and relating on that daily feeling that whatever looks interesting to me on that given day. Because that's kind of how I make all my quilts anyway.
And it's so interesting how you've just, as you explained, taken these basic elements and keep moving them and moving them. And then the red ties it all together. Do you want to talk a little bit about the
Yeah,
color?
this piece, when we hang these either museum or wherever they get hung, I'm looking at how it's fitting the space. So there were 3 new pieces that were at the National Quilt Museum that you didn't see at the International Quilt Museum, because I'm always designing pieces to fit the space that they're currently being exhibited in. Mostly because I want you to be enveloped by this. I don't necessarily want you to walk in and see each piece individually on the wall like you would maybe in another exhibition. I want you to come in and be hit by the color. And red is very confrontational, it's passionate, it's compassionate, it's so many different things to different people. And some of these colors are colors from my childhood. So I have that connection, because I think, we all sort of carry our own color baggage on what colors mean to us. And because this red is a confrontational color, you're going to have a reaction to it. And that's really what I'm going for when people walk into this room is, back when I was in college and people, this whole conversation that happened between what is art and what is craft, I'm trying to push the envelope. And, they say art is something that evokes an emotion, and you can't tell me that quilts don't evoke an emotion. They really do when you walk into this room, and how the colors come at you, because they're not shy pieces. They're loud and they're in your face, and you can't ignore them. And whether that makes you uncomfortable or comfortable, or you love them or you hate them, all of those are the correct answers when you walk into the space, because all of those things have provoked an emotion. And that's what I'm really going for on these pieces.
Yeah. Were you able to hear, watch people seeing it in either Lincoln or Paducah and sort of, you know, anticipating their reactions, or did you get reactions that surprised you?
Each location has been different. Yes, I definitely was at both locations so that I could have that reaction. Spending all that time, like I said, this has been like 7 years I've been working on this. So then all of a sudden to have them in a museum, I might only see them there for a day or two, and then I leave, and it's like, wow.
Yeah.
I felt like I was leaving my children behind. It was really harsh to kind of walk away, but it was amazing to have the reactions. And I've kind of had both reactions. Most people walk in and be like, wow, like it physically hits them when they walk through the doors at the International Quilt Museum. The layout at the National Quilt Museum is a little bit more expansive and open, so they're slightly less less in your face. They still are, but it's a completely different vibe and a feeling, which that excites me. And people who hadn't seen the other exhibit and only saw this one, they would have similar reactions, but in a different way, which I thought was really interesting. I feel like at the National Quilt Museum, the pieces are sort of more ready to have a conversation with you personally, and you're able to see them in a slightly different way than at the International Quilt Museum when they were exhibited, when you were just completely kind of slapped in the face by them. And I love that. I love that
Yeah.
so much. And having had the experience of both, where someone walked into the International Quilt Museum and they're like, nope, can't look at this, it's too much red. That's fair, right?
Yeah.
And then the next person who comes in and is just like, wow, and like, that was really cool to see. So
It's so rare to have an exhibition like this that is changed for the venue.
experiential too.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's meant to be an experience as a whole. And yeah, so always trying to, it's been really fun that it wasn't just about designing the quilts, but also designing them to fit the space and to be in the space, and how that they're hung to get the
Yeah.
reaction that I want people to
Yeah.
investigate when they walk into the space. So that's been really cool.
So you've spent years working on this book and it's out now, and you've spent years working on these particular pieces that are in these shows, and I'm sure there will be other venues. So beyond these two things, what's next for you, Victoria? Can you share what you even know yet, but can you share what you're
Ah,
working on? What's the next big thing?
well, I have another series that I've been also working on for probably 8 or 9 years. So that's the Virtual Voyage Pixels to Patchwork exhibit. That'll be on at the Pacific Northwest Museum, opening in June. I
Mm,
continue to make pieces for that. I continue to make more pieces for the Option Expedition. And I continue to make more of the quilts from this book, because I do show in this book the sort of the experience quilt, but I'm also showing you 6 10, I can't remember how many other quilts that you can do with the blocks that are within in the book itself. So I love sort of diving into each of those things. And, you know, as I'm teaching from the book, I'm making more of those quilts. Can't get away from that. But yeah, and I still have a long list of some other things that I'd like to get to. I just don't have enough time in the day to get to everything. But
Yeah.
I do have another idea for something I want to work on. And hopefully I can start working on that project this year. But I'm trying to slow down, and I'm clearly not very good at doing that.
Yeah. That's okay.
I do know for myself that I do work really well when I have a lot on my plate. So
Yeah. Yeah. That's
just the
great.
load is looking a little different these days, but yeah.
Oh, Victoria, tell us a little bit about how is this book set up? It's so interesting with the stories, but you also have patterns and several quilts featured that people can make.
Yeah, so I shared with you about the Experience quilt, and basically a lot of these quilts, the Experience quilt in general, and a couple of the quilts in the back show quilts that are not built on a grid. This also kind of goes back to the quilt that I talked about at my quilt QSOS story, because I talked about my everything but the kitchen sink quilt, and that quilt is sort of what I highlight in this book as being the Experience quilt, because it's a quilt that's not set on a grid, and it's a sort of a hodgepodge of a lot of different blocks, very much like a sampler quilt. So in the book, I'm showing the main quilt, but I'm also showing a couple different variations of how you're picking color and how you could plan it or not plan it, or throw all caution to the wind and just make all the blocks as you go and just play with whatever you have at the end. But then I also want to be able to show you that with each of those blocks that you can make those as individual quilts as well. So just like and anytime when I'm designing a quilt, you know, I'm trying to show, I'm thinking about all the different variations that I could do with one single block, right? So I'm kind of doing that the same way throughout this book, seeing how you can put it together in an interesting way, and also how you could play with color value and change it and turn it into something completely different. So I love to be able to have as many different options as possible. And each of the chapters of those themes that we talked about, you know, I have sort of a story that I tell at the beginning, and then we're looking at everybody else's stories, and then at each one of those themes has its own block. So there are basically the 12 blocks that come together into the Experience quilt, and then also all of the quilts at the back of the book. So you have a lot of different options, because that's just the way my brain works. It's never
Yes.
it's never just a one quilt kind of an idea. There's always multiple ways, you know, to do that. And honestly, that's the fun part, I think.
Yeah, I've got my
Of
eye on
quilt
one of
making.
those quilts in the back already, so I'll just add
Yeah,
it to
that's
my
great.
list of Victoria patterns that I've made.
Yeah, yeah. There's some really interesting ones. You know, one of the blocks is called the Jubilate block, which is actually a variation of one of the quilts in my Option Expedition series. There's a quilt called Loops and Lines, and it has some really interesting play on making quilts that look like a double wedding ring, but it's not a double wedding ring, and it's only a 12-inch block, so that's kind of fun. And then also seeing it in different variations by combining a couple of the blocks, the dimensions block and the loops and lines, gives you a whole secondary really cool pattern. Florist quilt, there's just a bunch of interesting things that you can do to find just things that maybe you think that they are difficult, but then you just find out it's just a 12-inch block and you can do
Yeah.
that. So I love being able to take people on a journey of some really simple blocks, and then start skill building as you go, so that you're learning what a partial seam, or you're learning some gentle curves, or you're learning something a little bit more curved. So, you know, having those options to see different ways that you can up your skills in ways that are totally approachable.
Well, it's always so inspirational to catch up and hear what you're working on, and to see all these pieces. I was one of the ones that walked into the room at the International Quilt Museum and was just really blown away by that particular exhibition, and obviously loved all the red, and it was just so beautiful. And your book is really cool too. So anything else you want to add before we open it up for questions?
Just that there's some really great stories in this book, and to have a box of tissues and a cup of tea or a cup of coffee next to you, and to take time reading through the book, and maybe there's beautiful imagery and all of that, but there's some really special stories in there. Some of my favorites, Meg Cox's foreword, I think is really powerful. Sarah Bond sent in a story of a very detailed story of her family history and quilt making, which just rips me apart because it's so
Yes.
powerful.
And
Paula Nadel
some people may
Stern
not know Sarah just passed away
passed
last
away,
year.
and
Yeah.
so it's
Mhm.
I'm just even happier that that story is in there
Yeah.
to really capture what a beautiful person she was. Paula Nadelstern has an amazing story about a visualized quilting party that I highly encourage people to read and experience. Yeah, and just, you know, you're going to laugh, you're going to cry as you're reading through the book, and to really be thinking about, you know, what's happening in your life as you're making your quilt, because the quilt's not just a quilt. Every quilt is a story.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Mhm.
Beautiful. Thank you so
Absolutely.
much.
Thank you, Teresa. It's so good to see you. Thanks for having a chat with me.
You're welcome. We'll turn it back over to Amy then.
All right.
Victoria, I'll ask you to join me now and turn on your camera and your mic. What a wonderful interview. And I'll also take this opportunity to say that Schiffer Craft, who published your new book, has offered a coupon code to our audience today. So if you all would like to purchase either of our presenters' books, you can, or any Schiffer title, you can use this coupon code. Victoria, thank you so much for doing this interview. I know you don't do a lot of interviews.
I get so nervous. You'd think I would get used to it after all these years, but trying to
Well,
get all the words out of my head.
yeah,
The
well,
ideas are there.
yeah, and you're also super busy making the work. So, and we all, I can say, speak for myself, but I'm sure most of our audience, we are stunned by this exhibit and by the book. Your work is so compelling and so heartfelt. It's so relatable. And the Quilt Alliance is so grateful that you included so many snippets of QSOS interviews that are range from just sweet and light to really, really profound personal stories.
Right.
And that
Well,
that was such a gift to the project. So thank you.
the Quilt Alliance has been a huge gift to me. You and I met couple years before my book came out, and you were the first person to ever do an interview with me, and at the time I was completely mortified. I didn't really see my future about where I was going with what I was doing, other than the fact that I love creating, right? So, you know, the idea that you can document the stories, because how many times have you, like, if I go thrifting or antiquing and I pick up some quilt and I'm like, I just want to know the story behind the quilt. I want to know what life was happening while that quilt was being made. And you know, that you guys solidified that in me from the start of my career, and also that's what I think was really important. And you know, what I really realized when I started working on this book, that how important that part of the community really is to me. Understanding that life happens and life is in the quilts that we sew every day. I mean, that's just good stuff.
That really comes through.
Mm.
And you know, I think it's it also, if folks want to look for the very first episode of our podcast, Running Stitch,
Mm.
Victoria, you were the first guest on that podcast, and the
That's
subject was
right.
first quilts. And Janniken Smucker, our host, found the clip in your interview with Meg where you say, well, I'm not really, you know, it's just so humble. I can't remember exactly what you said, but it's so super humble. And then in the podcast, you're looking back on that and saying, okay, now, you know, yes, I won Best in
Right.
Show and Quilt on the first QuiltCon. I mean, that's the great thing about stories too, is just keeping tabs with someone through documentation, seeing where their trajectory is going, and then having them comment on that prior interview or video.
Right.
It's so cool. I
Yeah,
love
thank
it.
you. Yeah,
Well,
it's been an interesting journey for sure.
yeah. I can't hog you this whole Q&A, but I do think it was so interesting that so many folks at the same time, when you talked about an app on your phone and moving the modules on the app, immediately jumped on that. And you said
Right.
that the app that you use, apps that you use
I use
yeah,
many apps because
that
I'm
was
looking
cool
to
to
get as
see.
many different options as possible, and
Right.
trying a new app just for the sake of trying a new app to see what kind of effect can I get. Because, you know, remember I said I was doing that as a way to manage anxiety on an airplane. So it's like it's taking me out of my studio, and how can I still create? So I was kind of using any photo apps that I had. I take the images, I can multiply the image, I can swirl it, turn it, you know, depending on the app, I can do many different things to it to kind of keep me thinking about my work when I'm not in the studio. And, you know, before I know it, I'm off the plane and I've got hundreds of quilts on my phone. So
Does that feel like play too? Is that another way of playing?
absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
love
And then I
that.
used those, you know, for 7 years before I ever got to make any of those quilts. It was just going back and just looking through those images, looking at all of the things that I kind of whipped up, and, you know, kind of waiting to see what I would have a reaction to, and waiting for time for me to be able to go, oh, well, now you can jump in and play and make these things. So, you know, that
Yeah,
wasn't
it's
until
like your
COVID when I
sketchbook.
could finally pick one and, you know, see what I could do with it.
Well, you are so good at multitasking, and I love that you're embracing it and saying that's just, I'm at my best when I'm doing that. And does having collaborators help you do that? Someone asks about, working with Shelley. Is it
Right.
Paglia? Is that how you pronounce Shelley
Poly
Wilson?
eye. Yeah,
Paglia.
Shelly Poly eye. She's my best friend, and she's a long armor. And we kind of came up together at the same time, kind of in our industry. And I was starting to make more quilts. I had the interactive website, 15 minutes play on the blogs, and then she had just gotten a long arm, and so we just kind of kept working on things together over the years. So having a collaboration with her on the quilting, it's not a difficult thing to do. We talk constantly, you know, we're constantly having, I'm shooting her images of things that I'm working on back and forth. We're having conversations about, you know, what do we think they should be, knowing that I keep making these pieces. We made decisions pretty early on that the quilting needed to stay pretty modern and pretty simple, and that the quilting would stay the same on all of the different pieces. Because at the same time, I might be thinking just of designing one quilt. I'm also thinking about how they're going to relate to the next quilt, and also thinking about how it's going to relate to a whole entire room full of quilts. Because again, the exhibit keeps changing depending on what I've made, where it is, where I'm hanging it, how I'm designing the quilts to be hung on the wall. So I'm thinking about all of those things along the way. And, you know, that's not a hard thing to do when your best friend's a long armor.
Yeah. That's a great situation to be in. And
Yeah.
she's amazing. Joan asked about the role the curator plays, especially in this new exhibit. Was there any interaction with the curator at the museums that you worked with, or did they just work to carry out your vision?
We certainly have conversations about, you know, what is possible, because there's certain things like you have to put stanchions around things so people don't as a tripping hazard. You know, that's not something I've designed in my head, but that's something that's a logistic of the museum to have to sort out. Figuring out how they're hung, depending on the dimensions of the room, you know, those kind of things, the technical aspects of that. But as far as the way that these pieces are hung, um, displaying how they're being displayed, that's part of my process. I'm also thinking about that when I'm designing the spaces. So the pieces that were at the International Quilt Museum, there were 3 new pieces at the National Quilt Museum because it was a much bigger room than what International Quilt Museum had. So we had a different feeling and a different effect by the way that they were hung at IQM versus the way that they're hung at NQM. And that's fine because they still give a whole different, it's exciting to me to be able to keep giving a whole different experience when you walk into that room. But I'm
And
still trying to, at a certain level, like I said, I made 3 more pieces for NQM because I want to be able to fill that space and to continue pushing that envelope between, you know, it's a quilt, it's art, it's craft, it's traditional, it's modern. How do I show all of those things, and how, you know, how do I keep pushing that envelope that quilts are art?
What a great incentive for the exhibition partners, the venues here, though, to have this exhibit change because, you know, anymore we can see so much virtually, and actually having an exhibition change, it's a moment. It's a, you know, it's a moment to say, I've been there, I
Right.
saw it in person. As a couple folks said in the comments, I just walked in, was like, whoa, wow. And Teresa said the same thing.
Mm.
Um,
Well, that makes me happy to hear it.
yeah.
I've also had responses more to the negative side, or they don't like the color, or it's too much color, or they can't look at the pieces individually, you know, because everybody has a different expectation. But to me, again, that's still promoting some sort of a response. And, you know, the response is really part of the biggest part of it is, you know,
Right, and
what do
isn't
you
that
see? How are you reacting to it? And being aware of what you're seeing and reacting to. You know, I think
right?
that that's the big part of the point.
That's what makes it art to me.
Right.
Folks are asking about, they need to know how many yards of fabric. Suzanne needs to know how many yards of fabric do you use to make these quilts? How many yards of red? I love that question. And
Red.
spools,
How much
miles
red?
of thread.
Yeah, the thread I don't know. That would have been a good thing. I should have just been tossing all those spools into a bin to keep track
Yeah.
of. But we did finally sort of add up after NQM how much red, and it's 110 and a half yards of fabric just on the red. So that's generally about 8 or 9 bolts of fabric
Mhm.
just of red. We didn't add up all the other colors, but the backings are also all the same color, and there's 173 yards just for the backings. That's about 11 bolts of fabric. But yeah,
I
so
love that you
there are
kept
the
track of it.
everybody asks, so we had to go
Yeah.
back and and add it up. It's pretty funny.
So this is an interesting question from Susan about color combinations. She says your color combinations are captivating and some of them are quite surprising. Can you describe your thoughts about combining different grouping of colors, and are there any colors you won't use? That's a great question.
In all of my works, or are we just thinking with the option expedition? Because those are the same colors in all of the quilts. The colors don't change in the option expedition series.
Right.
And they were mostly colors that I have a strong connection to from my childhood. Red for International Harvester, everything is painted red on the farm. You know, our bedrooms were aqua, orange is my favorite color, you know, so there are things that I have my own personal vibe with the colors. In my other works, and like, you know, because I'm doing modern or traditional or scrappy or art quilts, whatever, I kind of make whatever floats my boat. I tend to put everything together, and that's part of the challenge is how do you make that work? I work on many pieces at one time, not just one. I work on probably 15, 16 pieces at a time. And I'm constantly having a conversation with them. They're on my design walls. I don't design on paper. I'm taking tons of photos. I'm trying different colors. I'm looking at how they're communicating with each other, how they behave next to each other, you know, what's working, what's not working, and just constantly going backwards and forwards on a piece and playing with color until I get it the way that I want. So no, all colors get to come to the party.
I love that. I think that we are running out of time, but I also want to ask about Maureen's asking, is the exhibition going somewhere after Paducah?
We're in talks of trying to figure out what and where that will be. I can't really say where that is 100% at
Sure.
this minute, but one of the things I will say is that the National Quilt Museum has worked really hard on working up a curriculum for K through 12 for STEM programs, and actually for STEAM programs. And so they've been using the exhibition and having a curriculum for all these different age groups to be able to bring kids in and have conversations about shape, color, design, math, like just a little bit of everything. And so we're looking at trying some more interesting venues where that application will be really valuable, I think, for
That's so
students.
cool.
Yeah.
You could
So
definitely
we'll
see
see.
how
I
it
don't know.
could be
Fingers
applied.
crossed.
Yeah, fingers crossed. And we'll look forward to hearing what, you know, all rolls out next for you. You are such a wonderful You just share so articulately about your work. I know that maybe you don't think so, but you really do. And I think your love of design shines through, and design's just about problem solving, right? And you do that problem solving with fun. You have fun, you play. It just shines
I
through,
think that's the
Victoria.
important part. If it's, if you love making quilts, then you have to keep it fun. Because if it's a labor, then you need to find a new hobby.
Yeah.
It should be fun.
Well, thank you so much for joining me live and for doing the interview.
Thank
And I
you.
want to share again our coupon code so that if folks want to take advantage of that. And I also want to share what's coming up on Textile Talks. Next week, Teresa is interviewing again. She's such a great interviewer. It's for a interview with Cecilia Cotman Shares for that SACWA is presenting. So I hope you will join us for that one. And then, and then also on the 28th, I mentioned earlier, we're celebrating our 250th show. Can you believe that? And we're going to have little snippets from each of the partners presented on that episode. We're also going to give some door prizes. We're going to hear from our sponsors, and we would love to hear from you. We have a phone number here. Emma or Lucy, if you can put that in the chat, folks can take that down. We'll also be sharing this on social media. Pick up an old school phone and call and leave us a voicemail about what your favorite episodes have been, what types of Textile Talks do you like. We would love to hear from you. You can also include it in the survey that's coming up in your browser following our episode today. But just a lovely time with you, Victoria. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Amy. So good to see you.
You're
Thanks
welcome.
everyone for coming.
Yes, thanks everyone. Thank you so much. And thank you to our sponsors and all our donors for keeping this amazing series going.